Okay, this is part 2 of my classification tutorial. For this one, we're simply going to look at our 3 domains and our 6 kingdoms so that you kind of understand how living organisms on planet Earth are classified and organized. There are probably in the neighborhood of 13 to 14 million living things on planet Earth. The problem is most of them have never been and have not been identified. Actually, let me take this a step back. There was something I mentioned last week in class. Scientists estimate, now of course this is just a theory, that in the Earth's history, which is arguably 6.5 billion years old, the Earth is 6.5 billion years old. In the Earth's history, 99% of all living things that have ever existed have gone extinct. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. Right now, there are probably 14 million organisms alive on planet Earth. Most of them we have not identified, and most of them we probably will never identify because they'll die and go extinct before we ever do. There are right now 1.75 million organisms that have been given a binomial name, that actually have been given a scientific name, a genus and a species. 2/3 of those creatures are insects. We are human beings. We are animals. We're actually quite rare, really, on planet Earth. Most creatures on planet Earth are not multicellular heterotrophs. But let's focus on the 3 domains right now. Look at the screen right here. You've got 3 major categories. One thing that Carolus Linnaeus did, he didn't do the domains. But what scientists have realized is that Carolus Linnaeus was very intuitive. He lived a century and a half before Darwin, and he was smart enough to know that things needed to be organized based on how creatures were structured, how they were built, what they looked like, what their reproductive habits were, and how they were similar or different from other animals and other creatures, other organisms. Well, one of the things we realized was that really simple was better. And when we look at 1.75 million organisms and we need to organize them, it seemed logical to just say, all right, stop for a second. Let's just put everything in 3 groups. Let's start with that. And that's what you have with these 3 domains. You've got bacteria, you've got archaea, and you've got eukarya. Now let me just make sure I'm really clear about this. Bacteria is what you think of when you think of bacteria. The stuff that makes you sick. E. coli, streptococcus, pneumococcus. But the good bacteria, the stuff that exists in your gut to help you digest your food properly, the stuff that naturally exists on your skin to, believe it or not, keep you from getting other types of infections. That's the bacteria. Oh, let me add this one. The bacteria that's used to make your yogurt when you eat it. That's live cultures in your yogurt that you eat, if you didn't know that. I know that's funny, isn't it? But most people don't know that. Or they do know that and they just choose to ignore it. That when you eat yogurt, you're actually eating microbes. You're eating bacteria. Isn't that gross? Anyway, so that's bacteria. But archaea was a unique enough ancient, quote-unquote, bacteria. They think perhaps something that existed 6 billion years ago, maybe the earliest living thing, and it hadn't changed, blah, blah, blah. We found it at the bottom of the Pacific Trench around these hot springs. But, these little volcanic vents. But now we have found them in other places. Whatever the case is, they're unique enough that scientists said, okay, well, they're single-celled. They are prokaryotic, which means they have no nucleus, and they have a cell wall. So they're bacteria, but they're different than other bacteria. So we're going to call them their own domain. We're going to put them by themselves. And as a matter of fact, bacteria, single-celled, prokaryotic, no nucleus, in other words, they have their own kingdom as well. Archaea have their own domain. They have their own kingdom. Eukarya includes everything else. So animals, plants, fungi, and protists all fall into the other category. Now what's interesting is that protists are single-celled. But what makes all of these common with one another, what makes these all similar to one another, is that eukarya comes from the term eukaryotic, or what means a cell that is more complex, typically larger than prokaryotic cells, and has a nucleus. The protists are single-celled organisms, but they are almost animal-like in their behavior. So if I might here, let me go to a site here on YouTube. And you know, the beautiful thing about YouTube is there's so many different things that you can find. So I'm going to go to YouTube here, and I'm just going to type in paramecium, and I want to show you. And again, this is something we watched in class the other day. This one right here. We don't need to get into the sound so much, but you can just kind of look at this video. Let me actually put it on full HD. But I don't know how well it's going through the screen here. And again, you could type this in yourself and look it up. Let me turn the volume off here. You can see these little hairs on the outside of the cells. They're called cilia. You can see that it's a complex cell. It's not a bacteria, a bacterium. It is a complex heterotrophic cell that moves around using these cilia, and it eats. It almost acts like an animal. It's a very complex creature, if you will.
Like a fish.
It does look like a fish. That's exactly what it looks like. But it's not. It doesn't have a brain. It's a single-celled organism. But see, that's a lot different than a bacteria. Here's another one. If we type in euploides. Euploides, take a look at this one. Euploides has the same kind of look to it. It's got these little flagella, which are little tails, and whoever's filming this is going to agitate this little guy here and make him move. But there you go. There he starts moving. But the point is that, again, that's a single-celled protist. Now, this isn't a bacteria. A bacteria just reproduces. One cell becomes 2, becomes 4, become 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and 256, and so on. And they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. This doesn't do that. This is just a little entity that swims around and eats. And amoeba tend to be like that. Slime molds, while photosynthetic, they're kind of like that. They don't have the same structure as other bacteria. They're eukaryotic as opposed to prokaryotic. So again, going back to this, that is why the kingdom Protista, is organized with plants, fungi, and animals, and is part of this domain called eukarya. So every living thing on planet Earth, to summarize, fits into these 3 domains. From those 3 domains, we find these different organizations of kingdoms. 6 separate kingdoms that were talked about in the other video. Let me see if I have another one. So if we look right here, we have, it says how animals are classified. Really all living things are. You have domain, then the next step down is a kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Notice this little chart gives the plural: domains, kingdoms, phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. If I actually go back one here and show you, so if we look at this, as to stay in theme to the last video, we were talking about wolves and other dog-like creatures. A wolf, so this is what we're going to get to, is the wolf, is part of the eukarya domain. So it's a multicellular organism that is made up of eukaryotic cells. Actually, it's part of eukarya because it is made up of eukaryotic cells. End of story. Cells with nuclei. Cells that are more complex and bigger. It is part of kingdom Animalia, which means that it is not single-celled, not a plant, not a fungus, but in fact a heterotrophic organism made of trillions of cells that moves around and has a digestive system. It is part of phylum Chordata, which means it has a backbone or an endoskeleton. It is a mammal, has fur, warm-blooded, gives birth to live young, nurses its young. Part of the order Carnivora, which means that it has an evolutionary history of eating meat and the skull structure to back that up. Part of the family Canidae, dog-like creatures. Genus Canis, which are dogs and wolves. And the species is Lupus, or the gray wolf in this case, Canis lupus over here, the coyote Canis latrans. So there you go. That is tutorial number 2 on the classification of living things. And of course, as always, if you have questions, you come talk to me. Oh, you want to say goodbye?
Bye.
Wave. They can't see your little hand. There you go.